There's a story that Radio New Zealand, which you're never quite sure of, there's never happy news on Radio New Zealand, just quietly, as we've discussed this morning. But there's a story on Radio New Zealand that the New Zealand Transport Agency, listen, they call it the right name. Goodbye Waka Kotahi, Josh. The New Zealand Transport Agency has halted $6 million worth of funding to the police until it's satisfied that the police have met their breath test targets. Now, you remember that about 130 police staff are currently still under investigation, as I understand it, throughout the country, after 30,000 alcohol breath tests were falsely or erroneously recorded. All right. So now the consequence of that would be that the Transport Agency is holding $6 million worth of funding to the police because it's not sure that the police have done what they said they were going to do. What a weird relationship, Josh. Just quietly, isn't it?
Very odd, yeah. Very
well,
odd.
I mean, that there should be any relationship between the NZTA and the police just strikes me as odd.
Well, I thought the police were fully independent, so
yeah,
it seems.
So they contracted to NZTA to do testing, whether it's needed or not, Josh. This would explain to me, Josh, why between work, during work hours between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., when frankly you're less likely to find drunk people, I am routinely stopped on regular occasions by the police for a breath test, Josh. And I do point out to them, why would I be drinking at 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. during a workday? Oh, just doing a job. No, they're not doing their job, are they, Josh?
No.
They're doing something at the behest of NZTA and their funding agency.
See, that brings up all sorts of issues to me.
It does. It does for me too. Yep. Does for me too. I'm sorry, isn't your job to... But now they know that they're a contracted employee of NZTA, and NZTA are withdrawing money from just at the moment or holding it because the police have been falsifying the tests. Gosh, they're in trouble, aren't they? Just quietly, as an organisation. I mean, if this was any other agency, if this was, I don't know, the IRD, the Ministry of Education, Department of Labour, MB, you'd be going, why don't you've sacked your chief executive who's covering up a crime of your deputy chief executive, and you had to get rid of another deputy chief executive because they were covering up as well, and then you've got a whole series of your senior management you've sacked or you've transferred them, and you've sacked them even after they've left you and headed other government agencies, whether it's Civil Aviation Authority or the Social Development Agency. What a crappy organisation that is. What a ridiculous. What a waste of money. But there you go. So then you've got 130 of your staff falsifying breath testing as well. Oh, and don't forget the scores of people apparently who've been inadvertently using their work devices for downloading pornography, some of it pretty iffy and illegal. Yeah, now, if that was any other agency of the state, you'd be going, you've got a problem. And you've got a serious problem, and it's a systemic problem, and it's a culture problem. Wouldn't you be thinking that, actually? Our guest now, Craig Stobo, joins us. Craig, if that was you, Craig, and it was your organisation or some sort of financial organisation of which you'd have been a part, would you be thinking you'd just routinely taken on dysfunction?
Well, you'd have to ask why you're being given that function or why the behaviour is that way. You'd ask the question, do they have the powers to change? I don't know.
I mean, it's just the gap there. The problem is the Police Act to me that gives the police a form of operational control remote from its political masters for the theory that, your political masters could intervene theoretically, but in this particular case, I'd say it's ended up in a completely dysfunctional organisation. Listen, mate, it's been a very interesting week because I'm thinking ahead to the next election, and government's run out of headroom soon when it comes to getting the economy right and taking that feeling into an election. What are we seeing at the moment?
Well, there's a couple of things in response to that. First of all, from here to the election in November, there's very little room in the legislative agenda to accommodate new policy changes.
Yeah,
So the incumbents are constrained by sheer volume of acts and bills that are going through Parliament, which makes it more difficult to do new stuff. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, is are the tailwinds of recovery emerging faster, which will provide positive momentum for the coalition or not. I've spoken about green shoots for a while, and I still think that's the case. And the business confidence survey that came out in the last week or so is the highest it's been for 11 years. Now, to get employment going, investment going, you need businesses to be positive about the outlook. And a combination of lower costs of interest and a lower exchange rate is certainly helping enormously. So those tailwinds are in place. How quickly they can emerge, yet to be seen. But there's settings that are kind of there for businesses to think carefully around expansion. And in that survey, a sector that has picked up quite strongly in optimism is manufacturing, which must be benefiting from the exchange rate, I suspect. I don't know, but that's a very powerful indicator that things have turned the corner in terms of the outlook. It'll take some time to get through to households, but it looks like businesses are much more optimistic.
Just being released just before you came on air, as the government's finances are being reported at the moment, is slightly worse than expected, and that's because the tax take fell. Treasury figures showed a deficit of $4.9 billion for the 4-month ended October, about $700 million higher than forecast in May's budget. And the deficit is mostly due to tax take being down because of lower company and provisional tax receipts. That would generally suggest, wouldn't it, that the green shoots that you see are in the future, they're not in the present or the past.
Correct. Absolutely right.
Okay. Listen, just on that though, you've made a really good point about the legislative agenda. You've got resource management legislation that's meant to be introduced. I think it's this week, Craig, which is going to
I
be
think it's December
probably
month. Yeah, December
yeah,
month. Yes,
yeah, that's right. So and then
and
that would be
that's already in the pipeline, though, isn't it? So
yeah, that's right.
it's new stuff that they might want more difficult.
The other aspect is Labor had a conference the last weekend, last Sunday. Chippy, leader of the Labor Party, was conspicuously, and so was Barbara Edmonds, the finance spokesperson for Labor, conspicuous in that they didn't promise a whole range of new spending and were promising caution. I don't know if you've met Barbara Edmonds or had anything to do with her. How does she strike you as an opposition finance spokeswoman?
Oh, well, no, I have met her, and very impressive background in tax. So she understands the finer details in that area. You'd think with that background she would be cautious about promising too much, which will help, I think, the Labor Party position itself. And everyone's trying to fight for the centre, right? So everyone's trying to find the middle ground to encourage voters to look at them. I think in some ways the announcement by Luxon a week or so ago on KiwiSaver contribution rates, it's kind of kicked off policy announcements, hasn't it, from here through to the election, and there'll be a package centred around the budget as well. So my strategic brain would be saying, why would you start the race too early and provide ammunition for the other side to reposition itself? So, there'll be a ramp up, won't there, between now and June on policies trying to attract voters' attention. And so you could argue Labor's starting off quite modestly, trying to capture that fiscal conservatism centre ground that I think the coalition is trying to occupy as well.
You and I have talked repeatedly. In fact, I think you were one of the first commentators to point out that one of the greatest risks going forward were our so-called international obligations under the Paris Agreement for the purchasing of offsets internationally, because we wouldn't get to our climate change targets by 2030. This week, during the scrutiny week at Parliament was going through, Finance Minister Nicola Willis confirmed what you've been saying all along, and that is we won't be sending billions of dollars overseas to purchase carbon credits, which I imagine would be music to your ears, Craig, because you've always said, my God, what the hell's this about? But the other thing was about that the suggestion they'd never been in the Treasury accounts, which was something else that you'd always argued about too, that although there'd been an estimate, it wasn't there. It's going to be a serious election issue, I imagine, whether or not the centre-left parties will sign up to repeat that policy of carbon credits here.
Well, yeah, and it sort of goes to this pragmatic issue of where you're going to get the cash from to be able to buy those units, which were carbon units in Europe, which were estimated by Treasury in their analysis of potentially up to $24 billion, subject to how fast we can close the gap by 2030 and the price of the units themselves in Europe. So yes, that's clearly demarcated as a line in the sand from one party that's saying we're not going to pay. If the other party wants to pay, they've got to convince the electorate that it's of a greater need than other parts of our community's needs in education or health or welfare, etc. The other consequence of that, though, is, you may recall as well, at another level in that whole structure is obligations under our free trade agreement with Europe, where the Europeans have negotiated or renegotiated, depending on how you want to think about it, the ability to censure, fine, demand, whatever, some sort of compensation if we don't meet our Paris agreements. So there's another layer there of international obligations that need to be thought about very carefully. But I think the Finance Minister is starting from the position of, and you kind of read it out earlier with our slightly worse domestic deficit, we don't have the money and we don't want to borrow anymore to buy European credits when they're working as hard as they can on their domestic agenda for greenhouse gases. So, yeah, it looks like that link's been severed now, at least under the coalition agreement and under the coalition and the current government.
The Climate Change Commission, headed by our old debating teammate Rod Carr, when he was chair of it, put together a series of recommendations as to how do we get to meet our obligations. They've been universally rejected, it would appear, by Climate Change Minister Simon Watts, including those payments overseas. Does it raise the issue of why we even have the Climate Change Commission, to your mind, Craig?
Well, the act is there, set it up. So I guess you've got to go back to the reasons for having it under the previous government. I mean, Minister Watts has been to COP. He was at the last conference of the parties in Brazil. So he's listening and taking the temperature. But the outcome from Brazil and Azerbaijan have been woefully inadequate in terms of meeting lots of people's desires and objectives. It's just falling through lack of consensus on the way forward. So that will provide a degree of concern for the minister around, well, what do we do here? But in the announcements he made a couple of weeks ago, he did make some pretty clever announcements around carbon sequestration and therefore eligibility for the ETS. So they're still supporting the ETS, they're still supporting reforms under their own domestic agenda, but they're clearly moving away from an international obligation framework for sure.
And in that respect, obviously, we're not alone. I think what was conspicuous at COP, wasn't it, was that the United States weren't there at all. China and India made no new commitments. India and Russia were lobbying against any particular restriction on fossil fuels, for example, as well, along with Saudi Arabia and other petro-states too, and successfully. Um, you do ask yourself the question: if the largest
Well,
emitters aren't doing anything, why should we?
and then there's the agenda item around transfer of funds from more developed to less developed countries to
Yeah, yeah.
cope with the effects of climate change or weather. So that's fallen down as well. So I think I think there's enough disagreement now that sort of begs the question of how do we move forward globally on this, or not at all, and we retreat to our respective sovereign issues in New Zealand, focused on needs of our people. So there's clearly a change going on, that's for sure.
So that's universal. I mean, that's throughout the world. Yeah. I mean, it's you're suggesting that you know 20 years ago there might be an optimism, 10 years ago that we might get there as a unified uh, global response. What you're suggesting is that as the rubber hits the road, and particularly as economies hit the expenses, um, there is a backing away from those international commitments.
Yeah, and we saw it when we were in Europe with the New Zealand initiative. I might have mentioned this before. The Dutch, their definition of ESG is energy, security, with Russia on the back door,
Mm.
and geopolitical stability. And so they've switched to the needs of their people, and they're announcing a further reduction in reliance on Russian gas by 2027. Their defence budgets are expected to go to 5%. Well, that money has to come from somewhere. And so you just have to rank priorities for your communities, and energy and security for your people. I would suggest, given the changing predominance of those thematics in Europe, are more important than the climate change objectives. It's just priorities. It's just almost for them, and you feel it when you're there, is just very existential. They need that to survive.
One of the things I had Rod Carr on the show. Oh gosh, might have been the start of the year, just as he was finishing up in his role as chair of the Climate Change Commission, and he was talking about sort of peak cow. In actual fact, I think it's always been a refrain of him that we've got to do something about the number of cows we've got in this country. It's also been a refrain from the environmentalists as well because they emit so much methane. I'm just noticing here that Fonterra have just outlined their quarter's earnings. They've noted that global commodity prices are higher compared to last season, and they've now got a total group tax profit after tax for the 3 months to October 31st for 278 million, up the equivalent of 17 cents per share. In other words, they're still going gangbusters as an economy and contributing to our recovery. We can't afford to reduce the number of stock in this country if we want an economy, can we, Craig?
Well, no, and it's up to the farmers themselves to meet the demands of buyers of our milk. I mean, a couple of comments on that. I think it may be in the Frontier report, but it may be elsewhere, that volumes are increasing, and milk volume has been a pretty good season. And secondly, global auction results are falling. So it's not quite as rosy as it was if you follow the auction data, which will be a little bit of a concern for the next announcement on the payout price, where that actually ends up. So we've got to keep our eye on that. But certainly that reduction in price is occurring because there's a supply response occurring in the rest of the world. More milk's being produced, which hits that auction market, and we're a large exporter of milk. It really affects us. So we just got to keep an eye on that price,
I,
the
I
auction price.
accept that, but even if, yeah, I mean, they've come up with a new midpoint, I think, of $9.50 per kilogram of milk solids is what they are. It's their forecast farm gate milk price range. That's what they're thinking at the moment. But even if it was to drop, the reality is that it provides an income source for New Zealand and New Zealanders that we simply could not fill through any other device, could we?
That's right. So there's two angles to that. One is the commodity itself, our reliance, 30% of our exports dairy. Or not as high as that, I beg your pardon. 30% of our exports in total are to China, and a large part of that is obviously milk as derivatives. So we've just got to be really careful around concentration risks. If stuff happens and you're concentrated in one commodity line and the major buyer is, a large component of your exports, just got to be really careful that we don't get upset by a pincer movement somewhere that upsets those two numbers. So, we need some more diversification. So, that European Free Trade Agreement that we did put in place, the export numbers are still rocketing, and it was $1 billion after 1 year. I think after 18 or so months, it's risen to $2 billion in our favour. So that's going extremely well, and there are more opportunities in Europe with their science funds, the defence needs they have, as well as service exports to Europe. So more diversification is critical.
You mentioned, because you've been to Europe recently and obviously looking at success stories, and we've talked about a few of those over the last few months. But one of the things that was interesting was and you've just talked about it again today, the feeling of insecurity, I mean literal insecurity, that a number of European countries have. As you know, the latest round of peace talks between the US and Russia haven't progressed at all. Russia seems as belligerent as ever. I think it was characterized in the Times this morning as suggesting that Putin just doesn't have a handbrake. Or the ability to turn left or right. Once he's set on course of action, see you later. That feeling, and so this has led to the insecurity you're talking about in Germany, the Netherlands, etc. Does that also have implications for New Zealand, and in terms of our economy and our economic relationships with Europe?
Well, as I mentioned, they have a giant R&D science funds, and our universities and research sector could benefit from applying for those project funds. That's the first point. I think secondly, they do not have the production capacity in at least Western Europe anyway, to meet the demands of plant and equipment required to be funded by that 3.5% to 5% uplift in defence spending as a percentage of GDP. So we can help fill that gap. What manufacturing, what production can we do here to supply them with equipment? I note today, I think there's now more discussion around the quarantined Russian assets actually now being used to finance part of the needs of Europe. Now, that will increase the arguments on both sides, won't it? If the Europeans use those frozen Russian assets for military use, it kind of ups the ante. So this whole piece of disastrous intervention by Putin is not going away. If you follow his belligerence, to use your words, you look at what he's done, not what he says. You follow Chechnya, you follow the Crimea, you follow Belarus, and you see a picture of orchestrated encroachment on sovereign states to rebuild what was, in his eyes, the Soviet Union. Yeah, and that pattern of behaviour is very much alive at the peace talks, where he said, they want to reclaim Ukraine. That's their objective, which is just not going to happen if the Europeans have their way. So, I think the escalation isn't going to stop. I think it's going to increase.
Well, overnight, Putin also is reported as saying, well, not overnight, it was the night beforehand, if Europe wants a war, they'll get one. So, I mean, he's clearly not prepared. Well, he's prepared to engage in the wider conflict, and I suspect that he knows that Europe is scared of committing men, munitions, money, individually as countries to combating Russian aim and ambition. Do you, and having been over there and talked to a number of of leaders of thought in Western Europe. Is it your view that they see him as intractable or still able to be negotiated with?
Oh, I think it depends which countries you talk to. I think if you talk to the Baltic states or Poland, you're going to get a very different view than Germany or France, for example. The former much more willing to contemplate aggression. Others are still trying to parley without success, which just leads to a dreadful attrition of lives on both sides. And the US increasingly appears unable to shift the dial.
No, they can't. No, that's right. They've failed to do so. All right. And finally, are you, apart from the resource management legislation, we don't know what that looks like. I think it's actually due to come into Parliament next week. I'll talk to you about that then and get your reaction to it. Can I ask, do you think it's going to shift the dial at all? I mean, the idea is to simplify planning in this country, to speed up development, to get projects completed within reasonable periods of time. You and previous guys of chairs of energy companies, etc. You've been at the other end of that particular imbroglio of resource management law in this country. Do you expect it to make a difference, Craig?
Well, I think it does try and rebalance the environment and economic objectives of what people are trying to achieve. But you don't just need the legislative or regulatory platform. You also need business confidence, you need profitable projects, and you need financing. So I think the latter are becoming evidently more achievable. And if the platform of regulation assists, then I am optimistic that that will assist projects get up and running with a greater emphasis on economics as opposed to the environmental side, which was the case before.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, we'll catch up with you again next week. I appreciate your time this morning, mate, or this afternoon. Look after yourself.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.
Craig Stobo, New Zealand's leading economic and fiscal commentator. Outstanding background, as you know. As I always say to you every week, we're very lucky to have him. 8 minutes.